Now, if you are a frequent visitor to my various channels and videos, you know that I'm not a big fan of hero worship or looking at the great men and women of history, that I prefer more nuanced and three-dimensional portraits. But I'm going to verge close to breaking my own rule today because I want to talk about one of my true heroes of Mormon history, Carol Lynn Pearson. Now, Pearson has lived a remarkable life. She is a noted playwright, poet, theologian, activist, and devoted believer willing to critique the institution. In fact, her life and her activities represent a crucial transition moment for the Mormon tradition. She witnessed and even influenced a number of very substantial changes, including fights over gender equality, LGBTQ inclusion, as well as the freedom of expression. But the church also transformed itself during these years, and so her life is a useful prism through which to view this evolution. She also represents a type of cultural critic that I wonder if it even exists anymore, that she's one of the last of her era, because she combines three things that I don't think we see in tandem very much anymore. She was a devoted believer and loyal to the LDS institution. She was also an outspoken critic of places where she believed the church came up short, not holding her tongue at any moment, but being willing to speak out. But even with that said, she had deep ties and connections to LDS leaders who listened to her, at least for a substantial portion of her career. I don't know if we have people who captured those three dynamics anymore. Fiercely loyal, devoted critic, as well as connected to LDS authorities. We might have individuals who have one or two of those elements, but I don't know if they have all three. Let me know if you can think of someone that I'm forgetting. And further, I'm wondering and partially worried that LDS leaders don't have that type of influence anymore, that they're not listening to the type of voices that Carol Lynn Pearson represented. So Pearson's life is very, very significant, and thankfully, she is providing her private records to be able to understand her both as a historical figure and her times as historical moments. Signature Books has now published 2 volumes in an expected 4-volume collection of her diaries, and the second volume is just out this month. The Diaries of Carol Lynn Pearson, Mormon author, feminist, and activist. Volume 2 covers 1990 to 2002, and Volume 1 covered 1956 to 1990. These are phenomenal treasures, insights into not only one of the most significant Mormon figures, but also insights into the era. So therefore, really crucial documentary sources, why I'm so glad as a historical geek that we can nerd out over them. And I want to highlight a few portions of them in this video. I want to talk about the significance of Carol Lynn Pearson's life and where she fits in Mormon history. I want to explain why these diaries are so important. I'm then going to read some excerpts that I think give some phenomenal anecdotes and represent why these are such great records. And then finally, I want to muse a bit more on why I don't think we have another Carol Lynn Pearson today, and why the current Mormon climate may not allow one. So a few background details on Carol Lynn Pearson. She was born in 1939 in Salt Lake City, raised mostly in Provo. She studied at BYU, where she became a poet, a playwright, and a performer, and a beloved writer for many LDS leaders, including Dallin H. Oaks. Oaks has a very fascinating through line throughout Carol Lynn Pearson's story, where she interacts with them on numerous times. She is good friends with many of her family. In fact, just digest this for a moment. She attended pro-equal rights amendment rallies with Dallin H. Oaks' mother. And she also frequently interacts with several of his siblings and children. And so you get this perspective. This is someone who is embedded in the Mormon hierarchy. She eventually marries Gerald Peterson, hence Peterson at the end of her name. Also an artist. They ran a press. They put together events. But Early on in their relationship, he confessed to her that he, in the words of the Latter-day Saints, struggled with same-sex attraction, but he wanted to work through them, and at that time, gay men were often counseled to marry women as a way to overcome their homosexuality. Spoiler, it does not go well in this instance, just like it does not go well in many of these instances. Eventually, he would leave the family to go explore his true sense of self, and then he is one of the many gay men in the 1980s who gets diagnosed with AIDS. At that point, Lynn Pearson takes him back into their home and nurses him in his final years before he dies. The subject of one of her best-selling books, Goodbye, I Love You, a masterpiece of Mormon literature that I strongly, strongly recommend. And after that point on, although she did a little work before that, but after that, she really dedicated herself to trying to be a bridge between the LGBTQ community and the LDS Church, a common through line. She's also a masterfully successful and popular author, poet, and performer, often speaking at major events, invited to deliver her poetry by church authorities at church functions. Her job as a playwright to produce a number of important works, perhaps most famously the play My Turn on Earth that many of you might remember, that second only to Saturday's Warrior might be one of the most important plays of modern Mormonism, teaching many Latter-day Saints what their doctrine and their notion of the family is. And she toured the nation performing her poetry and her plays and her one-woman acts that really made her a household name for an entire generation. So even if it just captured the intricacies of her own life, these diaries would be significant. They talk about her struggles within her family, her own faith evolution, her attempt to get various works and poetries published, her attempt to write the movie Thumbelina and then have all her great feminist ideas cut out and the movie eventually flopping. But that's a story for another day. So even if these diaries are just a great source into her own life, they would be worth their weight in gold. But they do something much more important than that. All right, before I go much further, just a reminder that if you enjoy this type of content where we geek out about the past, talk about how it frames the present and our contemporary world, make sure you are subscribed to this channel, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get little icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing, rigorous scholarship, trying to improve our discourse online. And I also recommend subscribing to my free Kit newsletter, where I provide announcements, links, and updates, as well as following me on my different social media platforms, especially Instagram, where I do supplemental videos and posts. That's enough business. Let's get back to today's video. So I want to highlight 4 reasons why I recommend these articles or these diaries, no matter your level of nerdiness or interest in history. First is the sincerity and earnestness of her message. She is someone who devotedly believes and is trying to work through. She is earnest, she is yearning, and she is wrestling with the same issues that many Latter-day Saints are wrestling with today. For instance, in her 3rd diary entry, at the age of 17, October 3rd, 1956, she wrote this: "All day long, I was distraught about the idea of polygamy in heaven. This came as a result of learning about this eternal doctrine and how it's still a live option, especially for those who are deceased. And her wrestling with that is going to be a lifelong struggle because she genuinely believes Mormon doctrine and therefore wants to confront these issues. This ends up resulting in her famous book, The Ghost of Polygamy, which came out about a decade ago. That's really a master work that forces the LDS Church to reckon with that. She knew she was keeping a record for Latter-day Saints when keeping these diaries. That's why she records her own internal struggles, as well as anecdotes that she hears from many other people, which is why this book is a treasure trove of lots of stories and anecdotes that really capture these tensions that otherwise might be left unsaid and unwritten. Second reason these diaries are important is because she was deeply connected to LDS leaders. She has frequent correspondence with not just Dallin H. Oaks, but other apostles and general authorities and Relief Society presidents. In fact, she is close friends with Eileen Clyde, who was called to the Relief Society presidency in 1990 and served for about 5-6 years. And she is able to get insights into what is going on in the Relief Society leadership. These types of records that she knows she is keeping for future generations because they are too important to get lost. She also has some fascinating correspondence with Dallin H. Oakes regarding gender equality and inclusion in lesson manuals, which is really fascinating. She writes one time after she attends a Relief Society, and the lesson manual just quotes, I think, 17 men and no women, and she complains to Dallin H. Oakes, who she knew, saying, why is this still a problem? And Oakes says, I'm sorry, we're going to work on it. And then guess what? A few years later, she writes him again and says, hey, I've been patient. You have not worked on it. I'm holding your feet to the fire. And again, he apologizes and said, this is what we're doing, yada, yada, yada. So it's a fascinating insight into this evolution of church practice that she gets through her connection to church leaders. Third, you get an insight into these grassroots efforts to try to reform Mormonism, especially on gender equality and LGBTQ inclusion. Insights from someone who truly is committed to and believing in the institution and wanting to change, working with others, working with affirmation and the people who end up pushing for queer children to have a place in the church. So many of these movements and ideas that are taken for granted in the Mormon tradition today, she was at the vanguard, and we can see those growth and their significance. And it also is a great reminder that Latter-day Saints have been wrestling with these issues for a long time. They are not a new development. So learning that history is crucial to knowing how we got here and where we should go forward. And there are lots of these historical moments, these clashes between LDS leaders and intellectuals that are very crucial to understanding modern Mormonism. For example, what we know as a September 6th crisis, where 6 intellectuals in September 1993 were disciplined, either excommunicated or disfellowshipped. She has a first-hand glance because she is also being questioned, and thankfully she has a protective stake president who stands up for her, but she is corresponding. She gives a blow-by-blow of the accounts from 1992 through 1995, showing that through these documents, it was not just a one-month issue, nor was it just limited to those 6 individuals, that rather this was something that went on for a long time. And she also rightly identifies that it's something that was done not out of power, and it was something that was driven by Boyd K. Packer, who she is able to confirm through these sources and her connections, but it was something that was out of anxiety and fear. And so she narrates quite compellingly the September 6th saga as a broader era, and that's just one example of these larger historical events. But I want to close this section by reading one portion to kind of capture her perspective, to give you a sense of this earnestness that's at the center of her message. And this really is, in my mind, Lynn Pearson at her best. This is from a diary entry on June 14th, 1992, at the dawn of this clash between intellectuals and leaders. She said, this is on page 68, by the way. I have a new analogy for my relationship with the church. My marriage to the church is to the people church, the rock bottom, down to earth, wonderful human beings and principles and practices, the ideals and the service, and all the truly marvelous stuff. This is my husband. I love him. My husband has a grandfather who lives in Salt Lake City. He appears to have delusions of grandeur. He thinks everything he does is God's will. He is controlling and obsessed with obedience. He is 100% patriarchal and afraid of women. Misogynistic indeed. I don't deal with him much, except for an occasional family reunion and newsletters that he sends out. After all, I do owe the existence of my wonderful husband to this strange fellow, and I will honor him for that. And then it goes on, but you can catch both her wit, her wisdom, and her willingness to engage in powerful ways that sometimes get overlooked or simplified in caricatures of church history and the history of its dissidents. All right, now I want to read to you a few of my favorite excerpts, which it was so hard to narrow down because there are so many I could highlight, but I'm narrowing myself down to just 3. One from the first volume of Diaries, one from the second volume. So we'll start with the first volume, and this is an account from a church movie, an instructional movie, and this comes from her diary on April 19th, 1976, on page 96 of volume 1. Yesterday, my Dave from the motion picture studio came by. In telling me all they've gone through and getting approvals for the first Vision movie, he told me that recently they showed the first cut to some of the brethren. In the film is a nice shot of the family around the table. It pans from Joseph Sr. around to others to Joseph and his mother at the end of the table. She reaches over and gives Joseph a warm squeeze on his arm. Thomas Monson's reaction to this when watching the cut says, quote, "Why did you feature the mother? We've got to feature the father. This is a priesthood-oriented church. We've got to feature the priesthood, not the mother." So that gives a sense of those tensions that they're wrestling with in the 1970s that thankfully some of them will improve. Some are still being wrestled with. All right, second excerpt is going to come from page 124 in volume 2. This is in the midst of the September 6th crisis. In fact, just in the wake of the 5 excommunications and 1 disfellowship. This is her entry on September 30th, 1993, where she talks with Marion D. Hanks, who is a general authority well known for being beloved by intellectuals and being willing to speak to them. So, quote, on page 124, "This evening I called Marion D. Hanks at his home. I told him first off that I was not being excommunicated. Him, why not? What's the matter with your stake president? Me, well, if you were my stake president, would you throw me out? Him, I would throw you in. Me, what do you think about all the stuff that's going on? Him, it's sad, very sad. I think it's one of the worst episodes in the entire history of the church. Me, do you think our friend Brother Packer is behind all of this? Him, it hurts me to think he has that much power, but I don't know who else it would be. He's a bully. Harold B. Lee was his mentor, and he has all of President Lee's bad points with none of his good points." That's coming from Marion D. Hanks. Again, these stories that would get forgotten were they not recorded in her diaries. And one final excerpt I want to share. This is on page 181. This is after when she was speaking with Eileen Clyde, one of the members of the Relief Society presidency. This is April 29th, 1995. "Yesterday afternoon, I called Eileen Clyde to say hello. She was not there, but her secretary put me through to her home. We had a good, brief visit. She had no good stories to tell me. She feels they've lost ground in the 5 years they've been in the position. They can no longer write the visiting teaching lessons, and what happened to the women's conference was a big loss. We're just figureheads now, you know." She had told me this before. And then she goes on to give a few more examples, including her most recent interactions with Dallin H. Oaks. So I hope that wets your whistle to where you see the power that's found in these accounts and why these diaries are so significant. So I want to close this video returning to one of the points I opened it with, which is my concern that there's not a Lynn Pearson for the 2020s Mormonism, even though thankfully she's still around and still lending her voice now in print form. And I also worry that Latter-day Saint leaders no longer have this type of voice that they listen to. Now remember, I pointed out 3 things that I think made Lynn Pearson unique. She was deeply loyal to the institution and genuinely believed the faith. 2, she was also fiercely critical and willing to speak out on where the church did wrong. But 3rd, despite speaking out, she still had these deep and intimate relations with church officials who were willing to listen to her. Now, I think there are people who have 1 or 2 of those traits, but I'm not sure we have people who have all 3, especially that last one, a connection to church leadership. In fact, I think Lynn Pearson even lost that 3rd element, where during the tumultuous 1990s, she lost her access to many church leaders, in part because she was no longer able to speak at official church settings. She is one of the people that suffered due to the purge that Boyd K. Packer and others pushed, which makes me concerned not just that there aren't people trying to fulfill the Lynn Pearson role. I think there are people trying to, but they don't have as much success due to the changing nature of Mormon culture, where everything seems so polarized and everyone lives in their individual silos, and church leaders aren't hearing that type of message that they would have in the past. Even Dallin H. Oaks, the same person who used to listen to Lynn Pearson, doesn't seem to listen to people like Lynn Pearson anymore. I don't think there are the general authorities that, like there used to be, that were known for speaking out on behalf of and defending and conversing with these intellectuals. People like Marlon K. Jensen and Marion Hanks, who appear frequently in Pearson's diaries. The general authority who perhaps came the closest most recently is Jeffrey R. Holland, the apostle who was an academic, got his PhD in American American Studies from Yale, and was known as the patron saint for Mormon academics, until the last decade, where he went to go through the same type of transition as kind of an embodiment of the broader transition the LDS Church was going through, to where no longer were those connections as well established. And I fear that's a major loss. Now, I will add a qualification that I do think there's a lot better conversations between like the LDS Church History Department and those types of intellectuals and scholars and church leaders. I think that relationship is better than it's ever been, but in part because there's not that criticism aspect that used to be in place from people like Leonard Arrington and others. And so I do think that's a loss. And part of this is, I think, bureaucratic. As Christine Haglund wrote in her wonderful biography of Eugene England, published in the University of Illinois Press Introduction to Mormon Thought series, Eugene England, who was a contemporary of Lynn Pearson and went through many of the same battles and struggles, he was raised in a culture where it was common and expected that they would interact with church leaders. But as the institution became more global, more corporate, more bureaucratic, there was not that bridge anymore. And he felt that loss, which is why in the end, he could no longer be protected. And that's why he was forced to resign from BYU in the 1990s, maybe a topic for another video. So in other words, I really think Lynn Pearson's diaries, in some ways, they collapse historical distance because they show that many of the issues that Latter-day Saints are struggling with in the 2020s, they've been struggling with for 50 years. But on the other hand, I see so much historical distance that we really live in a different culture now than we did then, and I think that's a loss. All right, in conclusion, I want to briefly say how lucky we are to now be living in an era where a lot of these sources are being available, that hopefully we can write histories of the late 20th century that are as rich and powerful and multi-layered as histories of the 19th century, that Lynn Pearson's diaries can now be put alongside Leonard Arrington's diaries or Claudia Bushman's memoir or D. Michael Quinn's memoir to help us understand these struggles between LDS intellectuals and the LDS institution. I'm excited for historians to dig into these records and help us wrestle with their meaning. I'm also very excited for the general public to learn more about Lynn Pearson, which is why I strongly recommend getting these volumes just published by Signature, because it really should, if we are worthy of it, it should prompt us to come to a reckoning with that history and recognize why that history still matters to us today.